was nice to go back to Berea Middle School and look into the face of kids who very much are like me when I was sitting there back in the 70s. But before that, I want to say something about this special lady. What it means to be Mary Duckett's son is honestly one of the greatest titles I can ever earn in life. I met a lot of folks in the room, or a few folks in the room, I should say, when I came to present at the Council of Foundation meeting in Spartanburg back in May. And a couple of folks, sort of engaged me, and someone like, "You're from Greenville?" I'm like, "Yeah." It's like, "Well, who's your family?" And I was like, "Well, I'm a Duckett. I grew up on the southern side. My mother's Mary Duckett." "Your mother's Mary Duckett?" The entire room stops. Right? It's lunch. It was lunch. And all I heard was, "My Lord, it's Mary Duckett's son. She ain't told us nothing." And so the next thing... And so the next thing I know, there is like this like 12-person phone call being made on a cell phone on speaker to my mother saying, "Your son's here," and we didn't know. So for the remainder of the convening, I no longer had a name or a title or a degree. I was Mary Duckett's son. And life doesn't get better than that. I say these things about this special lady. You guys know her because you encounter her on various fronts. But I say these things because I think it goes to why we're here and why we're having this conversation tonight. One of the things that's been said about Mom is that Mary Duckett will always ask you for a favor, and it will never be for herself. Now, when we talk about economic mobility, money's a lovely thing, don't get me wrong, but it's really just battery power. What matters to me is not just the money. It's all the other things that the money supposes it represents. And so I grew up rather rich, not with money, but very rich because I did have love and support around me in the form of this special lady. And so when I had an opportunity to fight some doctors, I was supposed to be a doctor, by the way, don't remind her of that. I ran off to Paris instead. But when I had a chance to sort of like tussle with some doctors here who had slightly differing opinions on mother's care as related to her cancer, it just gave me that much more encouragement to stand in my sense of self, to be proud of who I was, to remember all of the various forms of gifts that have been provided to me, the support I have received, the angels in various forms throughout my life in this story of me as a black boy born in 1965 growing up in Greenville. And it just made me that much more proud to be from here. So I am a child of Greenville. I'm a son of South Carolina. I am a proud Southerner. And I also know that had I stayed living here, you wouldn't be talking to me today. That I'm convinced of. Now, why does that matter? Because I think everyone in the world does the best they can with what they have or what they know. And the question we're all toying with is, what is it that keeps this data looking the way it looks? It's not a mystery. It really isn't. I work at Living Cities. We're a collaboration of 18 of the largest foundations and financial institutions in the US. Gates, Ford, Rockefeller, Cerdna, Kresge, McKnight, Prudential, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank. I can keep going. I run 2 big bodies of work for them. You can't get more well-resourced than who we are, not as a collaborative. And then you add another data point to it. Anyone that really likes US history will appreciate the fact that in 1913, the 16th Amendment was passed levying the personal income tax. Before that, it had been business taxes. If you think about history, robber barons made all the money in railroads and steel and all the other things associated with the machine age. And so we were facing the First World War. We all just, looked at historical look-backs on that recently. And it was time to try to figure out better ways to raise money to support this growing experiment called the United States. It was also time to try to figure out how we fit into the world lineup, given that the European powers were struggling with crazy stuff and the world war was ramping up. Where was money coming from? And so if you were a robber baron sitting on a big pile of money and never had to pay personal income tax until now, what would you look for? It's the same thing we saw in the data slides. You look for tax deductions. So guess when foundations were created? No mystery. Look it up if you like history. And so when we look at ourselves sitting here connected to philanthropy, to charity, to nonprofit work, and we look back on the history of the United States as it relates to foundational giving and charitable tax deductions, it's been 100+ years. And what's really different? The wealth gaps that we see across the country at present are actually similar to the pre-World War II wealth gaps that we saw. So where did the progress go? What's going on? People, we actually know what's going on. We just have to be brave enough to own it and to talk to the people around us in a way that encourages them to think differently. I thought it was a beautiful statement. It isn't about changing the world, it's about changing ourselves. So what gives? What is it that we're willing to push ourselves around and embrace? Oftentimes when I'm engaging in these conversations around racial equity and inclusion or diversity and inclusion, and I tell my story of how I grew up in the South and other such things, I pull out data points around household wealth gaps. I pull out data points around access to capital and all these sorts of things. I get all kinds of feedback. And it becomes quite fascinating. And so what I actually say to rooms that look very much like this is I actually don't need anyone in this room to care about me or people who look like me if you are part of the historical wealth structure of the country. And people are like, what do you mean, Dimitri? Well, let me tell you. I like history and I like data, right? 2 + 2 is 4. Water is wet. Now, whether you like the number 4 is a different story. Ask me what I think, ask me how I feel, not always the same thing. Water's wet. You may not like water, but it stays wet. Data. Real facts. So if you are connected to wealth and you know people who are connected to the historical systems of wealth in this country, I would ask you, where do you think we're going next? I would ask you, who do you think we are as the superpower that we still like to believe ourselves to be? Then I would push economists in the room and ask you, what do you think about how the US economy currently stacks up? Our $18 trillion plus in GDP, 12 billion or so of it is all consumer product sales. What do? How do we fit in? A lot of that's post-Second World War. So who's on our heels? What's going on? What do you think about China? What do you think about India? What do you think about the BRIC countries in general? And then you say, well, why should I care? I'm American, I'm fine. Well, I've said this before, much like fish in water, you don't think about the water until it's gone and poisoned. So we're comfortable being Americans and being middle class. I do well. I pay more in taxes. God bless you, mother. I pay more in taxes than my mother ever earned and most of the people in my family ever earned. So I got my form of economic mobility. God bless me and my family. I got a kid in school, and Lord knows I wish somebody would write me a check because he's in medical school. But that's another story. But when we look at these structures, we've got to ask ourselves questions. We're already, either by market exchange rate or purchasing power parity, meaning like that Coke test where all the economies get balanced based on like the price of a Coke. That's the construct around it. If you look at that, we're already behind the 8 ball as a US economy. 2050, if you look at charts, you just see us well behind India and China based on all the current projections. And then you can use a proxy, let's say the UK economy. It is so flatlined compared to us, it's ridiculous. And then you kind of go, well, what does that even matter? Well, remember, $18 trillion, 2/3 of it, 70% of it based on consumerism, which is our thing. Like we buy something to express every emotion as opposed to just expressing emotion. That's our culture. That's who we are. That's who we are as a country. And then you start to look at data points, real data points. How many people here actually know that over half of America's school children are kids of color? Do you know that? Data point. That's real. So when I say to you that by 2044, over half of this country will be made up of citizens of color, you shouldn't be surprised. They're already in school. Why does that matter? Because you've got enormous household wealth gaps. And so if you're a target, you wonder in 2050, who's going to be buying my products? Because if all the money's been held by rich white families, how many Target discounts do you need? How many shoes? How many BMWs can you own? How many homes can you live in? That 2/3 that has kept us being this world power is part of what all of those projections are trying to get us to see in this mirror. Remember, it's not a secret, people. We live it. But when it benefits some of us, we have really no motivation to change it. So what are those systems? We know that we're a hyper-racialized country, always have been. And being from here in Greenville and in the South, we know what concentrated power and wealth has meant for some families. So again, I'm telling you, me and my people have been here 400 years and we've been through a lot and we've survived. We know what struggle is, we don't always like it, we hope for greater outcomes. There's lots of folks of color who've gone through that. There are some folks not of color who've gone through that. And so whether I have to speak Russian, which many of us may have to do if this keeps playing out the way it's showing up, or Mandarin, we'll be okay. It's just another oversight. We'll survive. But what I would ask you, for the people, if it's you or people you know, I would ask you, are you prepared to do just what the British have had to do? Remember, the sun never set on the British Empire. They're struggling for light, right? Anybody read the Brexit plan? Basically, they get fisheries. Wow, congratulations. The United Kingdom, the British Empire, of which we are born, that ruled the world as grandly as anyone. It's over for them. So why do we think it won't be over for us? So I ask you to go be selfish. If you know people who sit in wealth and power and influence, I tell you to go tell them to be as selfish as they can. Not for themselves, but about their future. Do they want to build walls around their homes? More than the subdivision walls we currently have, right? Do they want their kids having to go study in China in order to be significant, the way we used to send kids to Europe when they were greater powers? What is it you want for this American future? Because anything other than that is just living in a really sad, dark place of make-believe. People, we have battery power sitting all around us. As Americans, as Greenvillians even more so. We all know the story about BMW planning to hire more people. We know how many businesses around here want to be able to hire more people. And then we say, why are these jobs open? And then we wonder, well, why aren't more kids educated? Why aren't more people trained? Why aren't more people ready? When we've built systems that keep you from being able to get a good job because you got jacked up in the system, we've seen that story. We know it was intentional. It served a purpose at a time. That purpose is over. Unless you want to speak Russian, unless you want to speak Mandarin, unless you want to be building walls around your house, unless you want to rethink how many different times you're going to have to get visas that you've never had to get if you want to travel abroad because you aren't so significant anymore. We've got to think seriously about this, people. And it scares us. It is frightening. Why? Because we've been trained in scarcity models, right? What does it mean when you say equity? People like to pretend that it means equality. It doesn't mean equality. It means tilting the table in favor of some people who've been overlooked and left out in the past. It doesn't take that much. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my personal story, and maybe to help you think about why I say what I say. So I grew up on the southern side, born in 1965. As a point of reference, again, history, that was a year in which everyone who looked like me right now could not necessarily vote in this country. So perspective, I'm not that old. At least my son tries to tell me I'm not there. Anyway, and I started school at Arrington Elementary in 1971. It was the first year that first grade was integrated in Greenville County. So my graduating high school class was the first one to go all the way through, completely integrated. Different people have different thoughts, good, bad, and otherwise. So little Dimitri, because his mother said, you can do whatever, blah, blah, blah. First grade, I get there, I had this blessed woman as a teacher, Mrs. Heatley, who followed me and my cousin, Vernie Jeffries, who now lives in Tokyo. We were the two black kids in the class. She took care of us, she protected us. She was a really loving, caring human being and teacher. She followed our educational careers for years to make sure that we were doing well to the best that she could. So first grade, PTA, first PTA meeting, I don't know if you even remember this, Mom. They were looking for volunteers for kids to do like the fun stuff. You know, there I am, a little 5-year-old going on 6. And I was like, I want to do it. I was the only black kid that volunteered to do like the ribbon twirls and sing the song and all that sort of stuff. I was like, this is fun, this is cool. And so this is what's tragic about it. There were very few, if any, black parents at the meeting. You know, Mother was an entrepreneur back in those days, and so she had the flexibility of being able to take off to support us whenever that was necessary, including driving us to school every day, by the way, with a gun on her front seat, because lots of very racist and aggressive people were out front every day at school, basically harassing 5- and 6-year-olds. Remember who we are, people. We know the system. So Mother actually is a trained shooter. By the way, do not do not bet this woman on hitting bullseyes. Don't do it. That and shooting pool, she will trick you. Don't do it. But the point that I raised is that mother had the flexibility. So she was at the PTA. We did go, and I was there, and I was super excited as a little kid, as little kids are. And I look out, and it's a sea of just white faces. And when I tell you that I still remember the parents jeering at me and saying words that we no longer say that start with N in public, I am not kidding. I don't know if I ever really talked about that with you, but I remember, and I couldn't understand it. That's who we are as Greenville. So I made it into, subsequent years. By third grade, they start testing. I actually tested ahead of the curve. By the time we got to fifth grade, I was testing on 7th and 8th grade levels, all those kinds of things. And then it came time to be placed at a middle school. It was Berea Middle because we had black attendance areas back then, no flexibility, no vote, no choice. So I went from Southern Side all the way out to Berea every day, 30 to 40 minutes each way. And so I get to 6th grade, excited to see my friends who I hadn't seen since 5th grade last year, those who were transferring over to Berea Middle, and I show up and I'm assigned to remedial courses. Right. One of the things I assigned to my grandmother, God rest her soul, is that I always tell people, my grandmama used to say, if the story don't make sense, baby, that's because the story don't make sense. And so my staff in New York, they all think I'm kind of crazy because I use all these, sort of aphorisms, all this country wisdom, and I use food metaphors. All of us get that, right? They don't get it, but they do learn from it, and they start to use it. And so the point is, if the story doesn't make sense, it's because it doesn't make sense. That means that something's missing in that addition, in that math. You press the equal signs and it doesn't add up. It's because you need to go do some research or do some reinterpretation or something. And so you ask yourself, 5th grade, testing 7th and 8th grade level, it's a 6th grade, what, remedial? Do you know why you still see me standing here today without having been tracked remedial for the rest of my career? It's because the woman sitting on this front row was that entrepreneur. She had the ability not to be stuck at Woodside. She had the ability to actually drive over and say, I don't know about your system and your processes, but this makes no sense to me, and you need to tell me something different. I was still forced to stay 9 weeks to prove myself. 10-year-old. I got to prove myself. No data supports this other than the recommendation of the teacher from 5th grade who said I needed to be in remedial. A couple of years ago, I finally remembered the data point I had forgotten. We had American History Day, and you had to choose a character and dress up and tell the story. And this is the 70s, people remember a lot's going on. And so mother had a lot of very intellectual and eclectic friends of all colors, stripes, and types. And some of what was going on was this notion of broader constructs of American history. Remember, Roots is going to be coming out just a year or so after this, right? So one of the characters I found was Nat Turner. I was like, I didn't know that was a thing. So I wrote about Nat Turner in 5th grade, and some of y'all are laughing because you know where I'm going. It was only because the movie came out a couple of years ago that I remember that had been I had completely forgotten. So when you now think about my 5th grade teacher listening to this little Negro boy from Southern Side, how dare you come in here and talk about Nat Turner and wanting to be free and willing to kill people for it, even though his people had been killed to put them into slavery, how dare you? I don't care if you test on 7th and 8th grade level, Demetric Duckett. You're going to remedial, and guess what? For too many kids, it sticks. Because their mothers and fathers work on the mill line and can't get off during the school days. We know the system, people. Y'all know the story. We know the story. We just got to face it. So Mary Decker came down. She says, no, I don't know this. So halfway through the year, I get to Mrs. Bray, beautiful, little petite woman, had perfectly blonde Dorothy Hamill hair. I'd just never seen that in person, only on TV. Do you guys remember Dorothy Hamill, the skater? Like, she had like that haircut, and I was like, that's a real thing, right? I lived on mostly black. I was like, wow, that's impressive. But she was another blessed woman who heard the story, who saw the data, and did not like the fact that I'd had to suffer that way for the first half of the year. So she spent a lot of attention trying to help me acclimate. Now I'm in the room with all the same kids who have been testing ahead, 6th grade. So I'll try to go a little faster. 7th grade, I'm honors everything. I'm in the honor society. I am one of the absolute most awarded kids on awards day. 8th grade, same thing. I move on to Berea High School, where I'm Beta Club, Mu Alpha Theta, names a National Honor Society, Governor's School, Boys State, go down the list. And there were some bumps here and there too. But like that data point, 5th to 6th, we know the system, people. And at my age, I now have too many friends in New York who tell me similar stories, and some of them escaped it. Right? So we're leaving people like me in remedial track lifestyles, and we think this is an amazing day. It's not amazing, it's intentional. Right? So if you want to do something, go talk to every 3rd and 5th grade teacher you know and see what kind of racial structures they're processing in their mind. What kind of biases are they processing? Because they're impacting kids and they're setting them up into systems that were intended to benefit very specific groups of people, primarily those whom we've come to call white. That's another whole thing. White. That's a construct, that's a Western construct, as we know, before this United States experiment began and there was this need for additional labor. Like, the people who we currently call white all used to fight each other, right? That's why the British are still trying to Brexit out. And why does that matter? Because there are some folks, even here, who weren't white when their forebears got here. If you were Jewish, if you were Irish, if you were Greek, Armenian, Persian, we can go down the list. A lot of those folks are white now if they choose. Not always, but they do have an option. So what does that mean? To me, white is a club. It's a way of living. Less so a race. It's like, who do you let in? Do you know that the Armenians literally petitioned the federal government to be considered white because they weren't? So if you can legislate people, we can get to the like one-drop rule and how that varied mathematically across like, the ocean. But like, if you could petition the government to become white and they let you become white, like that's really a thing. That means it's a club. And so when we think about white as a club, when we look at the household data, we look at wealth, we look at opportunity, we look at expansion, then we can actually, as Americans, going back to not wanting to speak Russian, Mandarin, or build things around our homes, we can consider some other people who can also benefit us as a collective in maintaining this broad construct of a life that we call American and that too many assume is just white. On paper, I'm white. Income level, I speak French, Portuguese, and Spanish. I've lived, worked, and traveled 5 continents, some 60 countries. I've banked the largest corporations in America, GM, Ford, Chrysler, American Express, AT&T, go down the list. I've managed a $2 billion credit portfolio across 16 countries. I've done all of that, but I wasn't supposed to be able to, right? There are those of us who have heard, not only are you not supposed to be able to swim or read well or speak English in what we consider a standard dialect, you're not supposed to be able to do any of those things. I've done them well. So again, if we think of white as a club, economically, then we can let some more people in. But we've got to be really intentional about how we go about it. I'll tell you another story, because it goes to why we get confused. I remember NPR, years ago, a Japanese-American woman recounting her memories of being a little girl, being pulled out of California with her family during the Second World War. They moved to they were sent to Arkansas. And so they get off the bus, they get to Arkansas and they need transportation, and so they're gonna try to take the bus, and the bus pulls up and they start to go in and they look, and she remembers her parents stopping and freezing. Why? Because we know what the bus looked like. The white people were at the front, there were black people at the back. If you were Japanese American, your home, your livelihood, everything just got jacked up out of a really crazy construct, and this is where you're being placed, who are you going to sit with? Because you're making a choice around how you're going to ally yourself. It goes back to the club. Her family could sit in the back in protest against power with the blacks, but in doing so, they were rejecting the power structure and would only see more ramifications. Or they could sit at the front with the whites, supporting the notion of nobody wants to be black, we all fight the darker thing more, and in doing so, accept a form of second-class citizenship. Guess which one they took? It goes back to who we let in, people. We get to make those real choices. So I'm encouraging you guys to honestly be selfish. Be super selfish. Let me run through a couple of things. So born, raised here, went through the school things went off to Furman, was pre-med, ran into some bumps there with some crazy teachers, switched to French so I could go live in Paris, took the MCAT on Saturday, left for Paris on Sunday in 1986 with this lady here trying to keep the radio from coming on because they were bombing Paris, and I knew she wouldn't let me go if she heard it. So I got it. Once I was gone, it was kind of over. And when I got there, this is something that was never in my head. I didn't even know that you could like go on foreign study. No, I'm the first to college. Like I didn't know those were things, but these were experiences. Again, I got led into clubs. I got led into the Furman Club, right? I got a scholarship. Why did I even consider Furman? There were Ivy League schools recruiting me, but nobody I knew told me to go to Yale, Brown, Princeton, Harvard, like so many of my friends in New York all went to now. So I went to the thing that was beautiful to us. It was Furman University. Why? Because the first black student at Furman, Joseph Allen Vaughn, was a personal mentor, one of my mother's absolute best friends. God rest his soul. Some of you may remember him as a teacher. He taught at Southside. He also was president of the South Carolina Education Association back during the Riley years, which I believe in great part is why Dick Riley became the education governor so that South Carolina could try to get off the 49th, 50th list on some things. And so I think Joe would certainly provide all kinds of insight that would let me embrace Furman in a very special way. So I was able to do that, got a great education. Tried to work at South Carolina National Bank after coming back because Michelin Tire, as you guys know, has a lot of French expats, and I worked at the Haywood Road branch as a teller, and they wanted me there because I spoke French, and I spoke French all the time when people came in the door. And again, I didn't know a whole lot about banking or anything. I just knew I had a paycheck. And so after about a year or so, I thought, oh, I gotta like look for upward mobility. Tried to get to the management training program. Not for you, little boy, little Negro. We don't do that. So that didn't work for me. So I left to go to graduate school, hence what Mother said. So I went to the University of South Carolina. My grades and experience were great enough for me to get a fellowship. I show up first day and everyone's, as the black kid, out of 150, almost 60 people, I was the black kid again. Like, really, people? Universe, what are you doing? And I go to receptions and people just assume that I'm affirmative action. Now, some of these are kids who went to schools way more inferior than Furman. Their grades were lower than me. Their SATs and MCATs were, all their other graduate school GREs and such were lower than mine. But because I was black, I had to be affirmative action. So skip ahead. I'm in the top 10% of the school in terms of grades, and I'm watching all the other kids because my fellowship was in the dean's office. So I'm watching how many people are about to be kicked out of school. These are the kind of models that people are running and that I've had to deal with. So out of graduate school, after living in Brazil for an internship, that Mother referenced, I lived in São Paulo. I had to learn Portuguese in 10 weeks as part of that. Again, remember, I'm not capable, right? I'm remedial. So I learned Portuguese in 10 weeks, as we had to do as part of grad school. Got recruited to PNC Bank, where I went through an 18-month training program to become a loan officer. As I was about to get assigned to the New York office for PNC Bank, there was only one slot coming open. Again, I'm the black kid in the entire credit pool, and there are a couple of guys right behind me looking for placements, but I'm the one about to be placed. And the credit supervisor that managed all of us was friends with them, not with me, and created a whole crazy thing that almost led to a lawsuit so that I couldn't get the slot so to stay open for one of them. Like, those are the kind of things that are crazy, right? So then out of that, I got recruited to Bank of Boston, which is where I did the global banking, stayed there for nearly 10 years, and then eventually after 9/11, moved into the space and community development and philanthropy. I was a senior executive for a CDFI, a community development financial institution, for several years. And then a couple of years ago, I joined Living Cities to help advise their impact investing work. So that's sort of my general big story. But this is what I would tell you. People like to say that I'm exceptional. They like to say you're exceptional. They say this to a lot of folks, and I reject that because it's actually part of the racist system too. I'm not exceptional, I'm an exception. I'm an exception to the system that wanted me to be tracked remedial. I'm an exception to the system that didn't want to recognize my academic accomplishments. I'm an exception to the system that didn't want to give me a job in order to move into management to have the economic mobility we're talking about. I'm an exception to the company that didn't want to give me my rightful opportunity to prove myself even within its model, all based on race. I am an exception over and over. I'm not exceptional, because when you think of me as exceptional, then 36% of those kids at Berea Middle School who look like me deserve to be where they are because they can't do better. I'm not exceptional, people. I'm an exception. Greenville's come a really long way. It's not the dusty town that I was a little boy growing up in, running up and down Main Street. It is impressive. My friends are impressed. I have a staff member whose parents, when they were looking to retire from Texas, actually just chose Greenville. They live just around the corner. Like, people love the city on so many, it's a beautiful city. I sell it. But sadly, there's still too many people who've not ridden that wave of inclusion and benefit and prosperity. And again, we know why. And the question is, who are you going to talk to? It's not comfortable. If it were easy, everybody would do it. Right? I tell my son that all the time when he says, organic chemistry is hard. And it's like, well, you want to be a doctor. That's kind of what you got to do. Right? So people, if we want to continue to be this great American country, this culture, we've got to face the really hard conversations. And some of us have got to go back into corners that the rest of us can't get into and push from there. So that's what I'm encouraging you to do.